Okay, statements that are generally considered as central to traditional theism would include the following. A, God exists. B, God is omnipotent. C, God is wholly good. D, evil exists in this world. The first premise establishes the theistic character of the position, obviously, and the second and third premises partially define the nature of that theism in question, so that the refutation of either one of those would entail the rejection of the first premise at the same time. That is to say, if you can show an inconsistency with either B or C, we will assume at the outset, and we will grant to the unbeliever, he will have shown us that God does not exist, because that's the kind of God we want to be proven. So everybody will grant that you have to have all four of these premises if you're going to be a Christian. Oh, that's pretty easy. Now, the philosopher aiming to criticize theism based upon these premises faces a difficulty at the very outset, doesn't he? Because if you have even the most elementary training in logic, you know that these propositions do not contradict themselves. Obviously, we've got to supply some statements which draw out the meaning of the lower statements in order to elicit that contradiction. All such additions must either be essential to traditional theism, or they must be the logical consequence of statements that are essential to theism. Or, on the other hand, they can be necessary truths, that is, truths of logic. So now we're going to allow the unbeliever to introduce premises, but we've set out the ground rules. You must give premises that I will affirm as being essential to my faith, the logical consequences of my faith, or the truths of logic. Mackey himself recognizes that problem, and he suggests that the necessary additional statements would be the following. E, good as opposed to evil. F, a good thing always eliminates evil as far as it can. And G, there are no limits as to what an omnipotent thing can do. Okay, both statements E and G. Am I blocking those statements? It just dawned on me I shouldn't have written right behind myself. Both statements E and G are necessarily true because they're analytic. Omnipotent means there are no limits, and E he takes to be good as opposed to evil as an analytic truth, and I would agree with him, it is. By definition, it's true. And so, if you can join E and G, behind me here, with B and C, we can now validly infer some other things. I'm going to start drawing out some conclusions. H, there are no limits as to what God can do. And I, the next conclusion, God is wholly opposed to evil. I beg your indulgence if you're getting tired of this sort of stuff. It's so obvious. Well, that's what logicians do. They work in the obvious. You'll understand why I have to, drag you behind this horse in a minute or two. So bear with me. However, since I does not indicate just how God might oppose evil, premise F does not follow from I. Moreover, F is neither essential to traditional theistic systems nor necessarily true. Indeed, it does not seem to be true at all. A good thing always eliminates evil as far as it can. Well, let's look at that. Everyone will recognize that there are cases where the production of some evil serves an overriding good purpose or an end which is otherwise unachievable. That is, that there are some cases where evil does contribute to a greater good. We're not using that as our rationale for the whole problem, but in terms of this particular premise, we don't know we want to introduce that. And conversely, sometimes a person can eliminate an evil in this world only by also eliminating a greater good along with it. That is, sometimes if we're going to get rid of certain evil situations, there are some things that may be evaluated as even a greater good, but they've got to go as well. In such cases where that is, it's not logically true then. Empirically, we don't find this to be the case. In such cases where people produce or fail to eliminate a relatively lesser evil than the good eventually realized, we do not hold them culpable. And that's true in any system of jurisprudence. It's true in this land, even in the bad state we're in. Hence, further attenuation to the argument is required. If one is to show that traditional theism embodies a formal contradiction, another premise will be needed, one which follows from the previously accepted premises or is necessarily true, and one which would contradict God's goodness or power. Now, so we've eliminated that. We're going to take that out, and we're going to try something else. Certainly a premise that would work in this particular case would be premise J. There is some unjustified evil. There is some unjustified evil. So that'll give the anti-theist what he wants. For instance, the gratuitous evil with which Madden and Hare speak in their book, the gratuitous evil of torturing innocent children and so forth, or the allegedly innocent children, the unbeliever, would say, now the only premise essential to theism, And relevant for deducing J, now remember you have to deduce it, would be D. That is, it's only from D that you can get to J, and thereby show that we're logically inconsistent. And D can only serve that purpose of being the bridge to J, logically, in conjunction with a further premise. That means it must be mediated. From D to J, there's got to be another premise inserted so you can get there, and that premise would be K. If there is any evil, then there is some unjustified evil. Okay, taken in conjunction with D, evil exists in this world. If there is any evil in this world, there's some unjustified evil. Consequently, there is some unjustified evil, and you're inconsistent, you Christians. Now, however, we must ask, what warrants introducing K? And what's going to justify this premise? How do you get that into the argument? K itself would first have to be deduced from another premise, and such a premise might be L. And L reads, every evil is such that if there is a good that entails it, there is a greater good that does not entail it. Okay, if for every evil there is another situation logically conceivable where a greater good would not entail that evil. That is, if you argue that now this evil is put here so that a greater good would be realized, the argument is no, but there's even a greater good than that does not entail that evil, and therefore there is unjustified evil. And L would have to be a necessary truth, or would have to be essential to theism. We're back to our problem. And it's not necessary to theism to introduce L. That is, no Christian's going to say, well, no, that's the case. And so it must be a necessary truth if it's going to be introduced at all. And since it must be necessary, so it could be introduced, and thereby K and J would be warranted only if it were logically impossible that L should be false. That is, we're getting to the end of the argument now. How is L going to get on the board? It's going to get on the board only if it's a necessary truth, which is to say that it's logically impossible that it be false. Is it logically impossible that L be false, however? Well, L clearly implies statements like the following. M, which is, praising the Lord, I'm sure, the last one I'm going to put on the board, that somebody's bearing pain is never a good state of affairs. That is, if L is true, then it also must be true that M, bearing pain, is, I'm giving it to you in the other form, is never a good state of affairs. Okay. So, M has got to be the case if L is going to be introduced. Because if M is not the case, then it's not the case that this is logically true, because it's conceivable that it might be false in the case of M. And if that's not logically true, therefore you can't get to K. If you can't have K, you can't move from D to J. And J is the essential premise. That's the rub. Everybody with the game plan? Okay. But now, so what we're down to considering, we've got it all out on the board. We see what we're up against, right? Logically speaking, you've got to have such an argument. But you see, I hope now, in the time that's remaining, to show that the very logical necessity of the argument is going to trap the unbeliever. Because you see, we've argued we mustn't take a cavalier approach to this problem. With respect to the emotional force of evil, we mustn't take a cavalier approach philosophically. It must be rigorous. It must be well-defined. It must be exact. It must be analytical. Okay, if it must be analytical, then he has to have such an argument. Without such an argument, it's back to different strokes for different folks. So that's where we are. And if he's going to have such an argument, he's got to argue M. What I hope you'll see, and most of you who've had apologetics, I'm sure have seen it long, long ago, is that he began in logic, didn't he? But now the unbeliever is going to have to argue a substantive, evaluative statement. He's going to have to argue bearing pain is never good. Never good. He can't argue that point. He can't introduce that premise. That is, that empirical fact, that evaluative proposition. Then he's not going to get his argument going. And if he can't get his argument going, then it's not problematic. And anybody with an imagination, anybody can think of counterexamples to M, can't they? Where the good realized in avoiding pain is certainly outweighed by the greater good achieved only by enduring the pain. For instance, at the cost of a needle in your arm, which is a slight pain, but it is pain, you might give a pint of blood in order to save your child's life. And therefore, bearing pain would certainly be a good state of affairs then. Therefore, M is false, and by modus tollens, L is likewise refuted. Thus, L is disqualified from being a necessary truth. With the obtaining of the dismissal of M, and thereby the rejection of L, J as well, the anti-theist fails to show that the set of beliefs maintained by us is inconsistent. Now, at this point, the anti-theist is driven to protest, though. Oh, wait a minute. We're not going to run out just that quickly. Let's look at that situation over here a minute. We are wrong, he says, about the goodness involved in bearing pain so as to save our child's life. He says our willingness may be noble. Our willingness to undergo the pain may be noble, but it certainly does not constitute our circumstance the greater conceivable good. That is, we can think of something that is better than having to give a pint of blood to save your child's life. That willingness of yours is only making the best of an already bad situation. And so he says the greater good would be a situation where either your child could not die, or if you could provide the necessary transfusion without pain to yourself. So why is there death? Why is there pain? And thus protests the anti-theist, bearing pain never is a good state of affairs. You may wonder, why is he getting so loud about this? Because that is the nub. You're going to come down to, and the unbeliever has got to insist in with vehemence that pain is never good. And that's not logic, friends. That's evaluation. That's emotion. That's what are my commitments to what constitutes good and evil. It never is a good state of affairs, he says. And thus we see the anti-theist would be driven to insist upon a moral judgment if he were to formulate and maintain a compelling problem of evil against us as Christians. Any formulation of the problem of evil will eventually require the introduction of some general premise similar to M. That is, it may not be this particular one, but it'll always be one that has that form. And that premise can be defended against the imaginative, hypothetical, vindicating counterexamples of the theist only by resorting to specific moral assertion. Such and such a circumstance is never a good state of affairs. That is, he must be able to make a moral evaluation if he's going to have the stringent form of the problem of evil, and consequently the cogency of his argument will rely upon the validity of his conception and his use of the word good in moral predicates. Now, at the beginning of this lecture, I started fairly slowly, and I tried to say that we're going to make sure that we clarify all essential premises. One of them is that such and such and so forth is never a good state of affairs, is never a good state of affairs. And now we must clarify the premise. What do you mean when you insist on an absolute moral indictment and you use the word good? What backs up that use of the word good? A thorough and critical analysis of the problem of evil requires one to continue into an investigation of the logical characteristics of the ethical discourse and elucidation of the precise meaning of the key terms involved in ethical judgments, such as M, to which the anti-theist is committed in taking up the problem of evil. Can the anti-theist provide an adequate account of the word good as it appears in his argument? That is, can he use good in that absolute sense which is required by the argument, and which, if you read Dostoevsky, emotionally every man has got to account for? Can the anti-theist provide an adequate account of good? If not, his argument asserts nothing, and it's got to be taken as an example of non-cognitivism. If we're going to be analytical in our approach, we're going to insist that good now be explicated.